The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of tension as the defendant Michael Reed stood at the center of it, all his crisp suit and confident posture hiding the storm beneath his calm exterior. The prosecutor Diana Hayes had just finished laying out her case, detailing the fraud and embezzlement scheme that had made Michael a millionaire at the expense of countless investors and families, his wealth a direct result of their losses. The evidence was damning, a series of financial transactions that tied Michael directly to shell companies designed to funnel money into his pockets without leaving a trace. The air in the room felt thick with anticipation as Diana delivered her closing remarks, her voice steady and cold. As she addressed the jury, Michael Reed was no longer a successful businessman in the eyes of the law. He was a criminal who had betrayed the trust of everyone around him. As she sat down, her gaze briefly flickered toward the defense table where Michael's attorney, David Keller, shifted uneasily in his seat. The case seemed cut and dry. The jury would likely deliberate for only a few hours before returning a guilty verdict. But Judge Emily Turner wasn't so sure. Her mind was elsewhere as the courtroom continued its proceedings. She had been here countless times before, yet today there was something about the case that gnawed at her, something that made her uneasy. As she observed Michael Reed's face, she felt a sharp pang in her chest. His eyes, dark and guarded, the face was unfamiliar, yet strangely familiar at the same time. Something deep within her stirred, as if waking from a long slumber. Her gaze lingered on him, her fingers gripping the sides of her bench as a growing sense of recognition washed over her. Who was this man? Why did his presence feel like a distant memory creeping into her mind? She tried to shake it off, but the feeling didn't subside. It only grew stronger until it consumed her. The world around her began to fade away. The voices in the courtroom grew distant. Her pulse quickened, and before she knew it, she was back in a memory long buried beneath years of silence. A memory of a summer long ago, of laughter and carefree days spent with a boy named Michael, a boy she had once called her best friend. How had they lost touch? What had happened to him? She tried to recall the last time they spoke. Was it after high school or before that? The memory was fading now, like a dream slipping through her fingers. She couldn't remember all of it, but she remembered his face, his smile, the way he had promised to stay in touch, to always be there for her. And now here he was in front of her, not as the boy she once knew, but as a man accused of crimes too vile to ignore. Her heart raced as she stared at him. The connection between them was undeniable, but it felt like a betrayal in itself. How had he come to this? How had they both come to this moment where their paths crossed in such an unrecognizable way? She looked down at the case file in front of her, trying to regain her composure, but the truth had already settled in her chest. Michael Reed, the defendant, was not just a stranger to her. He was a piece of her past, a piece she had buried for too long, and now it had returned to haunt her. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Judge Emily Turner tried to steady her breath, her mind racing back to a time when everything was simpler, a time when she and Michael were inseparable, two children bound by friendship and shared dreams. They spent their days by the riverbank laughing as the sun dipped low, casting golden light on everything around them. Emily remembered the warmth of his hand as they ran through the tall grass, the way his laughter echoed in the quiet moments they had shared every summer since they were 5 years old. It was in those moments that she had felt the safest, when they both knew that no matter where life would take them, they would always have each other. But now here she was in this cold and sterile courtroom, facing him not as the boy she once knew, but as a man accused of betrayal so deep it was hard to comprehend. The weight of it pressed heavily on her chest. She looked at Michael sitting there behind the defendant's table, his face hard and unreadable, yet his eyes locked with hers, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of recognition. It was as if the years apart had never happened. Their bond was still there underneath the layers of time, but so much had changed between them since those innocent days. What had happened to him? Why had he disappeared from her life? Without a word, Emily couldn't recall exactly when they lost touch. The memories felt hazy now. The years between their separation stretched out like a vast chasm. She remembered him leaving town after graduation without telling anyone where he was going or why his sudden departure had confused and hurt her. But she never asked questions, too afraid of the answers that might follow. She tried to move on with her life, threw herself into her studies, focused on becoming a lawyer. While Michael was gone, she had never expected to see him again, not like this, not in a courtroom where his freedom and reputation hung in the balance. But here he was still with that same air of mystery about him, the same charm she remembered. But with the darkness lurking just beneath the surface, it was as if the boy she had known had never truly left. He was just hidden under layers of a man she didn't recognize. Emily could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the rush of memories flooding back in overwhelming waves. She needed to pull herself together. She couldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. Not now, not in the middle of such an important trial, but her heart was screaming at her, telling her to reach out to him, to ask him what happened to the Michael she once knew, the boy who had believed in doing right, the boy who had made promises to never let her down. But the man in front of her was different, and that hurt more than anything. She had to focus on the case. The evidence was damning. Michael's financial records and his connections to fraudulent schemes couldn't be ignored, but there was still a part of her that refused to believe the man in front of her could be so cruel, so heartless. Had he really changed that much? Had he really fallen so far? Or was there something else at play, something darker than anyone had imagined? Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this trial was about more than just money. It was about truth and the painful reality of what happens when the past collides with the present. Emily's mind raced as she sat at the bench, her eyes never leaving Michael. As the trial continued, the weight of his presence in the courtroom was unbearable. She had always prided herself on being impartial, the kind of judge who could separate her personal feelings from the law. But now that line felt impossibly thin, as if it was dissolving with every passing second. She tried to focus on the case, on the evidence being presented, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Michael's face was burned into her mind. She could barely process the words coming from Diana Hayes, the prosecutor, as she cross-examined the witnesses, or the dry technicalities of the financial reports. They were talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled through shady accounts, but all Emily could see was the boy she once knew, the one who had shared late-night conversations under the stars about their dreams for the future, who had promised to always be there for her, even when the world seemed to pull them in different directions. She remembered how he had spoken of success back then, how he wanted to build something bigger than himself, how he swore he would never let anything or anyone come between him and his goals. Those conversations had felt like promises, ones she believed would never be broken. Now, it felt like a cruel joke that the same person who once spoke of hope and ambition was the one sitting in the defendant's chair, accused of destroying the lives of so many innocent people. Emily's chest tightened as she watched Michael's face, his stoic expression never wavering, but his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for something, as if he too was trying to make sense of the situation between them that had suddenly become so impossible. She wanted to believe him when he said he was innocent, but the evidence was overwhelming. The documents seemed irrefutable. The bank accounts traced back to his name, the shell companies linked to his signature. Everything pointed to him. She tried to remember the last time they spoke before he disappeared. How had they parted ways? What had he said to her? Then had there been any sign of this path he was on now, any clue that he had been capable of this kind of deceit? But it all felt so distant, so out of reach, like a dream fading with the morning sun. Had Michael truly changed over the years, or had she simply not been paying attention? Was it possible he was caught in something bigger than himself, something he couldn't escape? She tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept circling back, her emotions clouding her judgment. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't afford to make a mistake in a case this important, but she couldn't ignore the strange pull she felt to him. It wasn't just the familiarity or the memories of their past. It was the sense that there was more going on here, something deeper than the charges in front of her, something she couldn't put her finger on. But it gnawed at her. Every time she looked at him, she forced herself to look away, focusing on the prosecutor's voice as Diana made her final points. The case was almost over. Soon the jury would deliberate, and a verdict would be reached, and Emily would have to make a decision that would affect not only Michael's life, but her own as well. She felt trapped between duty and the ghosts of her past. How could she render a judgment when everything about the trial felt so personal, when the line between right and wrong had become so blurred? Could she really separate the judge from the girl who had once known him so well? Could she even trust her own instincts anymore? As the trial continued, the tension in the courtroom grew thicker with every passing minute. Emily's thoughts were a whirlwind, each memory of Michael pulling her further into a vortex of doubt and confusion. But she couldn't afford to let her mind wander. Not now. She had to stay focused on the case. Yet every time she glanced at Michael, her resolve cracked just a little more. He seemed so calm, almost too calm for a man who was facing the possibility of years behind bars. His demeanor unnerved her. It felt like he wasn't just fighting for his freedom, but hiding something deeper, something she couldn't yet understand. It was during a break in the trial that the first real bombshell was dropped. The defense team had presented their own evidence, attempting to discredit the prosecution's claims. David Keller, Michael's lawyer, stood with a stack of papers in his hand, his voice steady as he presented what he called critical new information. Emily watched as Keller handed over documents that seemed completely unrelated to the case, at least at first glance. But as the pages were passed around the courtroom, the gravity of what they contained began to settle in. There were names. Names of people from Emily's past, people she had grown up with in that small town, the same town where Michael and she had spent their childhood. The names were associated with a series of investments and business deals that on the surface seemed completely legitimate. But as the details unfolded, Emily realized the truth. Michael hadn't just been part of some corporate fraud. He had been involved in the manipulation of her old friends, people she once trusted, coaxing them into risky investments that resulted in their financial ruin. The documents were clear. He had used his childhood ties to pull people into a business venture that ultimately benefited him and his backers while leaving everyone else in the dust. Emily's pulse quickened as she scanned the names on the papers. Asterisk asterisk Jack Lawson asterisk asterisk, a man who had once been like an older brother to her, was one of the victims. He had always been kind to her, someone she had looked up to as a child. And now she saw his name listed as one of the people who had invested heavily in Michael's venture. What had happened? How could Michael have betrayed the very people who had once supported him? Emily's stomach twisted as she imagined the pain Jack must have felt, watching everything he worked for crumble because of a man he trusted. But Michael's actions weren't just about money. The more Emily read, the more she realized that his business dealings had cut deeper. He had used his charm and his memories of their small town to manipulate people into trusting him, playing on their nostalgia and their longing for success. It was clear now, Michael had used their shared past to get what he wanted, and when the business venture collapsed, those who had believed in him were left with nothing. Emily's head spun. She couldn't deny it any longer. Michael hadn't just become a businessman. He had become a master manipulator, using everything he had once claimed to care about to destroy those who had been closest to him. The connection she had felt for him now felt like a betrayal in itself. The boy she had once trusted had become a stranger, a man capable of exploiting even the people who had once given him their loyalty. As the courtroom waited for the next phase of the trial, Emily was left alone with her thoughts. She couldn't stop thinking about Jack's face, his trust in Michael, and the reality of what had been done to her friends. But even as the evidence mounted, part of her wanted to believe that Michael wasn't completely to blame. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this story than what the documents suggested. But was that just wishful thinking? Or was it the last flicker of hope for the boy she once knew? The weight of the truth pressed down on her, suffocating her sense of justice. She had always believed that the law would be enough to uncover the truth, but now she wasn't so sure. Michael had been a part of her life in ways no one else had. And now, the pieces of that life had shattered into something unrecognizable. The courtroom was electric with tension as Michael Reed took the stand, his hands clenched at his sides. His eyes briefly flickered toward Emily, but she quickly looked away, her pulse hammering in her chest. There was something about the way he moved, the slight hesitation in his voice, that unsettled her. He was no longer the confident, untouchable businessman he had once appeared to be. Today, he seemed smaller, almost broken, like a man who had been cornered by forces much larger than himself. David Keller, Michael's defense attorney, stood beside him, his voice calm and measured as he guided Michael through his testimony. "Mr. Reed, please explain to the court the events that led to the accusations against you. What is your side of the story?" Michael cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the room before he began speaking. His voice was low, almost pained, as he started recounting his version of events. Emily listened intently, her heart racing with each word. What was he going to say? Was he going to admit his guilt or try to justify his actions? She couldn't decide whether she wanted him to speak the truth or stay silent. "I didn't do this on my own," Michael began, his voice shaking slightly. "I didn't set out to destroy anyone's life, least of all the people I grew up with. I was forced into it. They asterisk me do it." His words hung in the air, heavy with a sense of desperation. The courtroom fell silent as Michael's eyes flickered toward the prosecution, his gaze hardening as he continued. "There are people much more powerful than me, people with resources, with influence, who put me in a position where I couldn't say no. They made threats against the people I care about, against my family, and I didn't know what else to do but comply." Emily's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't the Michael she remembered, the boy who had laughed in the face of danger and had dreamed of success on his own terms. This was a man who was broken, a man who seemed to be telling the truth, or at least part of it. She couldn't deny the pain in his voice, the raw emotion that seemed to seep through every word. Was this manipulation, or was he really a pawn in a game he couldn't control? He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for someone he could confide in. His gaze locked with Emily's, and for the briefest second, she saw a flicker of vulnerability, of regret. It was as if the years of silence between them had evaporated in an instant, and for a heartbeat, they were both that scared, uncertain pair of teenagers again, standing on the edge of the world with no idea how to navigate the chaos around them. "I know I've done terrible things," Michael continued, his voice breaking. "But I didn't want to hurt anyone. I was just trying to survive, trying to keep those I loved safe. And when I realized what was really happening, it was too late. I was already in too deep." The room was quiet, the weight of his confession settling over the courtroom like a heavy fog. Emily felt her heart twist in her chest. Michael wasn't just a criminal. He was a man caught in something much larger than he had ever imagined. And yet the question remained, had he made his choices freely, or had he been forced into a life he never wanted? Diana Hayes, the prosecutor, stood up and walked toward Michael, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Mr. Reed, are you suggesting that you were just a victim in all of this? That you were helpless in the face of all the fraud and manipulation that took place? That your hands were tied?" Michael looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not saying I'm innocent. I'm saying that I didn't have a choice. And the people who really need to be held accountable. Those who orchestrated everything from the shadows. They're out there. They're still out there, controlling things from behind the scenes." Emily's mind was racing. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but they didn't make sense. If Michael was telling the truth, who were these mysterious figures pulling the strings? Who could be so powerful, so manipulative, that they could force Michael into a life of deceit and crime? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't seeing, something buried beneath the surface of this case. As Michael's testimony ended, Emily sat in stunned silence. The trial was far from over, and yet everything had changed. She had entered this courtroom thinking she knew who Michael Reed was, but now she wasn't so sure anymore. The boy she had known was still there, but he had become something else entirely. And the question that haunted her wasn't just whether Michael was guilty. It was whether there was something far darker, far more dangerous than anyone had yet realized. The days following Michael's testimony were a blur of conflicting emotions for Emily. The courtroom was alive with speculation, whispers about Michael's words swirling through the corridors. His admission that he had been coerced, that powerful figures had manipulated him, had caused ripples in the legal community. It was a claim that changed everything. Was Michael Reed truly a victim, or was he simply spinning a narrative to save himself? Emily didn't know what to believe anymore, and that uncertainty gnawed at her, distracting her every waking moment. As the trial continued, Emily's gaze often drifted toward the defendant's table, where Michael sat, his eyes dark with resignation. There were moments when he seemed to glance in her direction, his expression unreadable. Yet it was the fleeting looks that seemed to speak volumes, as if he were silently pleading for her to understand, to see past the man accused of fraud and find the boy she had once known. That connection, fragile, distant as it was, still hung between them, and every time he looked at her, it became harder to ignore. But Emily couldn't afford to be sentimental. The case was bigger than their shared past, bigger than the friendship that had once defined her childhood. The facts were clear. Money had been stolen, lives had been ruined, and the people Michael had once cared about had been left in financial ruin. The more the defense pressed their narrative, the clearer it became that the stakes weren't just about Michael's freedom. It was about trust, betrayal, and the very nature of loyalty. One afternoon, just after the court session adjourned, Emily received a private message. The note was left at the edge of her desk, hidden among her papers, its contents simple yet shocking. Asterisk, there is more to Michael's story than you know. Meet me tonight. Asterisk, no signature, no indication of who it came from. But the urgency in the message was undeniable. Emily's pulse quickened. Was this a chance to uncover the truth behind Michael's cryptic testimony? Or was it a trap, a way to draw her deeper into something she couldn't control? Despite her reservations, Emily knew she had no choice. She couldn't remain in the dark any longer. If she wanted to understand what had happened to Michael, what had led him down this path, she needed to follow this lead. After all, if Michael had been manipulated, then there was someone else out there pulling the strings. Someone who might be more dangerous than she ever imagined. That evening, she drove to the location specified in the note, a small, dimly lit coffee shop on the outskirts of town. The place had an air of quiet desperation, as if it had seen more secrets shared than it cared to admit. When Emily entered, the bell above the door jingled softly, and she immediately felt the weight of eyes upon her. She scanned the room, her gaze landing on a figure seated at a corner table. The man was cloaked in shadow, his face barely visible, but there was no mistaking the sense of familiarity that washed over her. She approached cautiously, her hand resting on the back of the chair as she asked, "Are you the one who left the note?" The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "I knew you'd come," he said softly, his voice low, almost a whisper. He gestured for her to sit, and after a moment's hesitation, Emily complied. "Who were you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. The man leaned forward, the dim light revealing his features. He was older now, his hair graying at the temples, but Emily recognized him immediately. It was Jack Lawson, the man she had once known so well. The man who had been one of Michael's victims. Jack? Emily's voice faltered, a wave of confusion and disbelief sweeping over her. What was he doing here? Why had he left her a message? "I know you have questions," Jack said, his eyes hardening. "And I have answers. But it's not just about Michael anymore. It's about the people behind him, the ones who used him, and everyone else, as pawns in a game much bigger than you realize." The words hung in the air, their weight sinking in. There was more to this than she had imagined. More layers of manipulation, more hidden figures pulling strings from the shadows. Jack wasn't just here to talk about Michael's guilt or innocence. He was here to tell her the truth about the power structures that had controlled everything. Emily leaned in, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean? What's really going on, Jack?" He glanced around nervously before speaking, his voice barely audible. Michael was never the mastermind. He was just a middleman. The real culprits are people with more power than you can imagine. People who have been operating in the background for years. They used Michael to get what they wanted, and when he got too deep, they turned on you. It's not just about money, Emily. It's about control. They've been pulling the strings all along. Emily's mind spun as she tried to process Jack's words. Asterisk control. Asterisk, what kind of people could manipulate someone like Michael so completely? The questions only multiplied, and the truth felt further out of reach than ever. The words hung heavily between Emily and Jack, the dim light of the coffee shop casting long shadows across the table. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information he had just dropped. Michael was a pawn. The people behind him, who were they, and how far did their influence stretch? Emily's heart pounded in her chest as a chilling realization took root. This was much larger than a simple case of fraud. This was a conspiracy, a web of power and manipulation that reached deep into the heart of everything she knew. Jack leaned back in his chair, his eyes darting around the room nervously. I didn't come here just to tell you about Michael, he said quietly. I came to warn you. You're getting too close. These people, whoever they are, they don't like it when someone digs into their business. They won't hesitate to take you down, just like they did to them. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Asterisk, take me down. Asterisk, she stared at him, confusion mingling with fear. Jack, what are you talking about? Why are you warning me? What does this have to do with me? Jack exhaled slowly, running a hand through his graying hair. He seemed to hesitate before continuing, as if weighing the consequences of his next words. You're too close to Michael, Emily, and that means you're in danger. They'll come for you next if they think you're getting too much of the truth. They won't stop until they silence everyone who could expose them. A cold chill washed over Emily, but it wasn't just fear she felt. It was something else, something darker. It was the weight of the past crashing into the present, a reminder that Michael's fate might not be the only thing at stake here. She had always believed in justice, in the power of the law to uncover the truth, but now she wasn't so sure. Could there really be people with that much control, that much power, lurking in the shadows, orchestrating everything from behind the scenes? Who are these people, Jack? Emily's voice trembled slightly, though she tried to keep it steady. What they want? What's their endgame? Jack glanced at her. His expression hardened, but his voice was soft, as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. I don't know all the details, but I've seen the signs. They've been using people like Michael for years, manipulating them to do their dirty work, making them rich in exchange for their silence. The people behind him, behind asterisk all asterisk of this, they're not just businessmen. They're powerful, connected, and they've been pulling strings in the corporate world, in politics, in places you wouldn't even imagine. The implications of his words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about money or fraud. This was about corruption at the highest levels, about people using their influence to shape the world in their image, regardless of the lives they've destroyed along the way. Michael didn't just fall into this by accident, Emily, Jack continued, his voice quieter now. He was chosen. He had the connections, the skills, and the background to be useful to them. But once he outlived his usefulness, they turned on him. And now he's taking the fall for everything. Emily sat back in her chair, her mind swirling with questions. If Jack was telling the truth, and part of her believed he was, then the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. Michael might not be the villain here. He might be another victim, caught in a system far beyond his control. But if that was true, then who was the real villain? Who was orchestrating this entire scheme? And why was Michael the one being left to bear the consequences? She felt a deep sense of unease settle over her. The investigation, the trial. Everything had suddenly become personal. She was caught between her duty to uphold the law and her growing sense of loyalty to a man she had once called a friend. But was loyalty enough to turn a blind eye to the truth? Could she risk her career, her reputation, to uncover the real story? The temptation was there, pulling her closer to Michael and to the dangerous web he had become entangled in. You need to be careful. Jack's voice broke through her thoughts. They won't hesitate to use anyone they can to cover up their tracks. They'll make sure the truth never sees the light of day. And if you're not careful, you could end up just like Michael, alone, isolated, and blamed for everything. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she realized just how deep the conspiracy went. Jack wasn't just warning her. He was offering her a glimpse into a world where power, corruption, and manipulation were the rules of the game. He had seen it all firsthand, and now somehow she had been pulled into it too. The question was, could she find the truth and bring it to light, or would she too become another pawn in their game? The weight of the decision before her was almost suffocating, but one thing was clear: whatever happened next, her life would never be the same. The next few days were a blur of doubt, fear, and determination. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. The trial was nearing its final stages, and every decision she made felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. She couldn't ignore what Jack had said. She couldn't simply dismiss it as paranoia or a last-ditch effort to cover up the truth. There was something more to Michael's case, something far darker than anyone realized. The question was, what could she do about it? Emily had always prided herself on her impartiality, her ability to separate her personal feelings from the law. But the more she thought about Michael's testimony, the more the doubt gnawed at her. Could she really send him to prison for something he didn't fully control? Could she punish a man who had been manipulated, who had been a pawn in a game played by unseen hands? And if she let him go, would she be letting dangerous people off the hook as well? The pressure was suffocating. She spent her nights combing through the case files, the documents, and the hidden clues that Jack had given her. She couldn't afford to ignore them, not now. As the prosecutor and defense team made their closing arguments, Emily's thoughts remained fixed on the unanswered questions. The money trail, the shell companies, the strange connections to her childhood, everything pointed to a larger conspiracy. But who were the masterminds behind it? How could she prove it? On the last day of the trial, just as the defense team was preparing their final plea, Emily made a decision. She would take a risk. She couldn't just sit back and let the system bury the truth. She had to investigate this for herself, even if it meant going beyond her role as a judge. The law might blind others, but she wasn't willing to let it blind her. As the courtroom filled with the murmur of the final arguments, Emily stood up. All eyes turned toward her. The room went silent. "I have decided to request a recess," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I need time to reconsider some aspects of this case. There are elements that require further investigation." The prosecutor, Diana Hayes, exchanged a look with the defense attorney, David Keller. Both seemed shocked, but neither immediately objected. Emily turned and walked to her chambers, her heart pounding as she passed the rows of empty seats, the eyes of the spectators burning into her back. Inside the quiet of her office, Emily's mind raced. She couldn't do this alone, not anymore. She needed to confront the people behind the curtain, the ones who had manipulated Michael and ruined so many lives. She needed answers, and if she was going to get them, she had to go straight to the source. Her first step was simple: contacting Jack. If he was right, and this conspiracy went deeper than Michael, then Jack knew more than he was letting on. She dialed his number, her fingers trembling as she pressed the phone to her ear. The call rang, and when Jack answered, his voice was hoarse, as if he had been expecting her. "You need to be careful," he warned. "If they find out you're looking into this, they'll come for you. There's no way out once you start digging." "I don't have a choice," Emily replied, her voice steady. "I'm not going to sit by and let an innocent man take the fall for something he didn't do. You said there's more to this. I need you to tell me everything you know." For the next hour, Emily listened as Jack recounted his experiences, revealing just how far the conspiracy reached. Names, dates, and hidden deals spilled out of him, each one a piece of the puzzle. Jack had been involved in some of these ventures, and though he had walked away, he knew the players involved in the lengths they would go to protect their empire. Michael didn't just cross them, Jack explained. He became expendable. "They'll do anything to protect their power, Emily. Anything." When the conversation ended, Emily felt a cold resolve settle in her stomach. The conspiracy was real, and Michael had been caught in the middle of it all. But now it wasn't just about Michael's fate. It was about bringing the true criminals to justice, no matter the cost. The next day, as the trial resumed, Emily walked into the courtroom with newfound purpose. She couldn't undo the choices she had already made, but she could change the outcome. She would use everything Jack had told her, every piece of evidence she had uncovered, and expose the people who had ruined so many lives. When she returned to her seat, she glanced at Michael. Their eyes met for the briefest of moments, and in that instant, Emily understood. She couldn't save him from the consequences of his actions, but she could make sure the truth came to light, no matter how dangerous it was. The gavel came down, and Emily spoke with a voice that was steady and unflinching. "After reviewing new evidence, I am issuing a delay in the trial. A full investigation will be conducted into the parties responsible for this scheme. The case will not proceed until we uncover the truth." A ripple of shock passed through the room, but Emily held her ground. She had made her choice, and now the real fight for justice would begin.